Hello, you beautiful anomaly. The world has always believed that power belongs to the loudest voice, the biggest crowd, or the most carefully crafted plan. They spend years designing strategies to predict your next move, convinced they've already written the ending to your story. But they forget one dangerous truth. A single sentence spoken with absolute conviction can shatter years of manipulation. Today, we're diving into the hidden force of your voice, the fearless confidence that makes every calculated scheme collapse. Stay with me because by the end of this journey, you'll understand why their perfect strategy was never strong enough to survive your truth. The most dangerous trap is the one that feels invisible. Long before you ever realized someone was studying you, they had already built a version of you inside their minds. They watched your reactions, measured your silence, memorized your habits, and convinced themselves they had solved the puzzle. Every smile, every setback, every moment of hesitation became another piece of evidence supporting their belief that you were predictable. They didn't see a human being capable of growth. They saw a pattern they thought they could control. That's how manipulation always begins. Not with force, but with certainty. The moment someone believes they have you completely figured out, they stop paying attention to who you are becoming. They only pay attention to the version of you that makes them feel safe. They assume you'll stay afraid because you were afraid before. They assume you'll stay quiet because you've chosen peace in the past. They mistake your patience for weakness and your discipline for surrender. People who build strategies around controlling others often become prisoners of their own assumptions. They spend countless hours preparing for every possible outcome, except the one they never imagined: you changing. They calculate your limits based on yesterday instead of today. They prepare arguments against your old mindset while completely ignoring the strength you've been building in silence. While they were watching your actions, they never noticed your transformation. Real growth rarely announces itself. It happens in lonely nights, difficult mornings, painful failures, and quiet decisions that nobody applauds. Every disappointment became another lesson. Every betrayal sharpened your awareness. Every insult strengthened your emotional endurance. You weren't standing still. You were evolving beneath the surface where no observer could measure your progress. That is why their strategy seemed perfect only from their perspective. It wasn't built on reality. It was built on outdated information. Imagine trying to win a chess match after memorizing your opponent's moves from years ago, never realizing they've become a completely different player. Confidence built on old knowledge eventually turns into arrogance, and arrogance always creates blind spots. Many people secretly depend on your consistency because it protects their own sense of control. If they can predict your reaction, they never have to question themselves. They know exactly which words will hurt you, which situations will make you doubt yourself, and which pressures will keep you trapped. Their confidence doesn't come from strength, it comes from repetition. They've seen the same response enough times that they mistake repetition for permanence, but nothing in life remains permanent. Human beings are designed to adapt. Pain teaches, failure educates. Isolation reveals truths that comfort never could. Every challenge you survived quietly rewrote your identity. The person they planned against no longer exists. Yet they continue treating you like yesterday's version because accepting your growth would force them to admit their own failure. There is something deeply unsettling about confronting someone who no longer reacts according to your expectations. It creates psychological discomfort. The mind immediately begins searching for explanations because certainty has disappeared. Suddenly, every prediction fails. Every assumption collapses. Every carefully prepared move feels strangely ineffective. They become confused, not because you became louder, but because you became different. This is why silence can be so powerful. Silence gives people permission to underestimate you. While they're busy creating stories about your limitations, you're creating new capabilities they never imagined. The strongest transformations often happen without witnesses. There are no announcements, no dramatic speeches, no desperate attempts to prove anything. Only quiet preparation. Those who rely on manipulation usually overlook one critical truth. Control only works when the other person stays emotionally frozen. The moment you develop emotional discipline, their influence begins fading. They may continue using the same tactics, but those tactics were designed for someone you used to be, not someone you've become. It's like trying to unlock a door after the entire building has been rebuilt. Eventually, reality arrives without warning. Their perfect calculations begin producing imperfect results. The conversations don't unfold as expected. The pressure no longer creates panic. The criticism no longer destroys confidence. The intimidation no longer commands obedience. Little by little, the foundation beneath their strategy starts cracking because it was never built on your potential. It was built on your past. And that is the greatest mistake anyone can make. Never confuse a person's history with their destiny. The strongest people are often the ones who transformed where nobody was watching, becoming someone so different that every plan designed to control them quietly expires the moment they choose to think for themselves. Silence frightens people more than anger ever will, because silence gives them nothing to attack. It leaves them alone with their assumptions, and assumptions have a dangerous habit of turning into false confidence. While they filled the empty spaces with stories about your weakness, you were quietly becoming someone they would never recognize. They thought your silence meant surrender. In reality, it was preparation. They believed you had nothing to say because you had nothing to offer. They never imagined you were simply waiting for the right moment, the right words, and the right version of yourself to emerge. There is an invisible strength that only a few people ever develop. It is the ability to observe without reacting. Most people are controlled by emotion. They explode when insulted, panic when challenged, and rush to defend themselves the moment someone questions their worth. Manipulators expect this. In fact, they rely on it. Emotional reactions give them information. Every argument reveals your fears. Every defensive explanation exposes your insecurities. Every desperate attempt to prove yourself becomes another tool they can use against you. But when you refuse to react immediately, something unexpected happens. The balance of power quietly shifts. Suddenly, they have no map. They cannot predict your next move because you haven't given them anything to analyze. They keep waiting for the emotional explosion that never comes. They prepare responses for conversations that never happen. Their confidence slowly begins turning into confusion because the person they thought they understood refuses to play the role they assigned. People often underestimate quiet individuals because modern society rewards noise. The loudest voice in the room is usually mistaken for the strongest. The person constantly talking is assumed to be the smartest. The one demanding attention is treated as the leader. But history has shown something very different. Some of the most influential people moved carefully, spoke selectively, and allowed their actions to become louder than their promises. Your silence was never emptiness. It was observation. Every conversation taught you something. Every betrayal revealed someone's true character. Every insult exposed hidden insecurity. While others wasted energy trying to impress people who never respected them, you invested your energy into understanding yourself. That kind of growth cannot be measured from the outside. It happens beneath the surface, where confidence replaces approval, discipline replaces emotion, and patience replaces fear. There is a psychological reason people become uncomfortable around someone who remains calm under pressure. Calmness removes their ability to manipulate the situation. If they cannot provoke your anger, they lose one of their greatest weapons. If they cannot trigger your fear, intimidation becomes useless. If they cannot make you desperate for validation, their opinions lose their influence. This is why emotional discipline appears mysterious to those who lack it. They cannot understand why their usual tactics suddenly fail. They repeat the same insults, expecting the same reaction, but your expression remains steady. They spread rumors expecting panic, but you continue moving forward without chasing every accusation. They question your value expecting self-doubt, but your confidence now comes from experience rather than approval. Many people spend their lives trying to appear powerful, Truly powerful people rarely need to announce themselves. Confidence does not demand attention. It simply exists. The strongest tree in a forest does not scream about its roots. The deepest ocean does not advertise its depth. Real strength has always been quiet because it doesn't depend on applause to survive. The interesting part is that your silence often reveals more about others than it reveals about you. Give someone enough silence, and they'll begin exposing themselves. Some become impatient. Others become defensive. Many begin talking excessively just to fill the uncomfortable emptiness. They accidentally reveal their intentions, their fears, and their motives because they cannot tolerate uncertainty. Meanwhile, you continue listening, learning more from their words than they ever learn from yours. That quiet observation becomes an advantage few people appreciate until it's too late. Instead of reacting emotionally, you begin recognizing patterns. You notice who only supports you when you're struggling. You notice who disappears when you succeed. You notice who smiles publicly but competes privately. You notice who constantly needs control because they fear losing influence. Every silent moment sharpens your awareness until reading people becomes almost effortless, while they celebrated believing they had already defeated you. You were mastering something far more valuable than winning arguments. You were mastering yourself. Self-control is one of the rarest forms of intelligence because it requires resisting the strongest impulse humans possess, the need to react immediately. Every moment you chose patience over impulse. You became more difficult to manipulate. Every day you focused on growth instead of revenge. You quietly increased the distance between who you were and who you were becoming. By the time they finally realized, your silence was never weakness. It had already become the foundation of a confidence they could neither imitate nor control. Because everything they believed about you had been built on the loudest illusion of all, the assumption that quiet people have nothing powerful waiting behind their words. The room was never as quiet as the moment before everything collapsed, not because people stopped breathing, but because certainty was about to die. Every manipulator lives for that moment when they believe they have complete control over the conversation. They rehearse every possibility, anticipate every defense, and convince themselves they've already won before a single word is spoken. They think victory belongs to the person who talks the most, pressures the hardest, or controls the atmosphere. What they never prepare for is one sentence delivered with absolute clarity, a sentence so grounded in truth that it dismantles years of deception in a heartbeat. Most people underestimate the weight a single sentence can carry. They believe change requires long speeches, endless explanations, or dramatic confrontations. But history has repeatedly proven that one moment of fearless honesty can accomplish what years of silence never could. Not because the words are magical, but because they are spoken by someone who no longer fears the consequences of telling the truth. That is where your real transformation begins. There comes a point in life when you've experienced enough betrayal to stop explaining yourself. You've been misunderstood enough to stop chasing approval. You've been underestimated enough to stop proving your worth to people who have already decided not to see it. Something changes inside you. The constant need to defend yourself disappears, replaced by a calm confidence that doesn't require anyone's permission. The people around you rarely notice this shift until it's too late. They continue using the same psychological games they have always relied on. They interrupt because they assume you'll stay quiet. They twist your words because they expect confusion. They pressure you because they believe you'll fold under discomfort. Every tactic depends on one assumption, that you are still the same person they manipulated yesterday. Then comes the moment they never imagined. You speak, not with anger, not with revenge, not with desperation. Just one sentence, delivered without hesitation, without apology, and without emotional chaos. A sentence so direct that it removes every hiding place they've been using. Suddenly, there is nothing left to argue about. The truth stands in the center of the room, and everyone can see it. That is why manipulative people fear clarity more than conflict. Conflict creates noise. Noise creates distraction. But clarity ends confusion. It forces reality into the open where excuses cannot survive. One honest sentence has the power to expose years of carefully constructed illusions because truth doesn't need decoration. It only needs courage. Psychologically, something remarkable happens in that instant. The person who expected control suddenly loses it. Their mind begins searching for another strategy. They may laugh to hide discomfort. They may become angry to regain authority. They may accuse you of changing, becoming cold, or acting differently. But those reactions are not signs of strength. They are signs of panic. Their script has failed, and now they're improvising. Notice how quickly confidence disappears when someone's plan stops working. The same person who seemed untouchable moments earlier now struggles to maintain composure. Their carefully rehearsed responses no longer fit the conversation because your sentence changed the entire direction of the interaction. They built their strategy around your fear. They never prepared for your certainty. The beauty of this moment is that it has very little to do with speaking. It has everything to do with becoming. A sentence only carries power when it reflects the person you've become through experience. Empty confidence sounds impressive for a few minutes. Authentic confidence echoes long after the conversation ends because people can feel the difference between someone performing strength and someone living it. This is why personal growth often remains invisible until the exact moment it is needed. Every difficult lesson, every lonely season, every disappointment you've survived quietly shapes the words you eventually speak. Your sentence carries the weight of every challenge you've overcome. It is short because it no longer needs unnecessary explanation. Wisdom rarely wastes words. Many people spend years collecting arguments, believing the strongest person is the one with the most evidence. But the strongest person is often the one who knows exactly what needs to be said and what doesn't. They understand that endless explanations are usually invitations for endless manipulation. Truth spoken once with conviction is often more powerful than 1,000 desperate attempts to convince people determined not to understand. From that moment forward, everything changes. The people who underestimated you begin questioning themselves instead of questioning you. Those who once believed they controlled the narrative suddenly realize they no longer control the outcome. Their perfect strategy collapses, not because you became louder than them, but because you finally discovered that one fearless sentence, spoken by a person who has mastered their own mind, can accomplish what endless fear never could. Darkness doesn't always hide monsters. Sometimes it hides the truth they prayed you would never discover. The most dangerous people are rarely the loudest or the strongest. They are the ones who survive by bending reality, twisting words, and convincing everyone that confusion is truth. They build entire systems around deception because they understand one terrifying fact. The moment someone sees clearly, their power begins to disappear. That is why manipulators fear truth more than they fear confrontation. A fight can be controlled. The truth cannot. Manipulation has always depended on uncertainty. As long as people question themselves, they remain vulnerable. As long as they doubt their own instincts, they continue seeking approval from the very people controlling them. This is why psychological manipulation rarely begins with obvious lies. It begins with tiny distortions. A memory gets questioned, an achievement gets minimized, an emotion gets dismissed. Slowly, a person starts wondering whether they can trust themselves at all. Once that happens, control becomes easy. Someone who no longer trusts their own judgment will eventually rely on someone else's version of reality. That is exactly where manipulators thrive. They become the narrator of your life, telling you what happened, what you should believe, how you should feel, and even who you are. They don't need chains when they can control perception. The prison exists entirely inside the mind, but every illusion has one fatal weakness. Truth doesn't disappear simply because people ignore it. It waits, quietly, patiently, like a shadow that refuses to leave. It follows every lie until eventually both collide. And when that collision happens, it is rarely dramatic. It is often one simple realization that changes everything. Suddenly, the patterns become obvious. The excuses stop making sense. The contradictions become impossible to overlook. What once appeared convincing now feels painfully transparent. This is why people who manipulate others become deeply uncomfortable around emotionally mature individuals. Emotional maturity creates clarity. It removes the desperate need to be accepted at any cost. It replaces emotional dependency with self-respect. Once a person develops that kind of inner stability, manipulation begins losing its effectiveness. Think about how often control relies on emotional reactions. Someone insults you, expecting anger. They criticize your dreams, expecting self-doubt. They spread rumors, expecting panic. Every tactic depends on triggering an emotional response strong enough to cloud your judgment. But when your mind becomes disciplined, emotions no longer dictate your decisions. You pause, you observe, you think before reacting. That pause is terrifying to someone who depends on controlling outcomes. They suddenly realize they can no longer predict you. Their usual methods produce unfamiliar results. Instead of defending yourself endlessly, you remain composed. Instead of chasing their approval, you continue walking your own path. Instead of arguing over every accusation, you allow your actions to become the evidence. Nothing frustrates deception more than consistency. Truth has a unique quality that lies can never imitate. It remains stable. Lies require constant maintenance. One false story demands another. One excuse creates 10 more. Manipulators eventually exhaust themselves trying to protect a version of reality that never truly existed. Every conversation becomes damage control. Every interaction becomes another attempt to maintain an image that grows weaker over time. Meanwhile, truth requires no rehearsal. When your confidence comes from honesty instead of performance, you stop worrying about keeping stories straight. You don't need perfect memory because you're not creating fictional versions of yourself. You simply speak from experience. That authenticity becomes impossible to imitate because it is built on reality rather than appearance. Many people believe truth always wins because life is fair. That isn't necessarily true. Truth wins because reality eventually exposes every contradiction. No matter how sophisticated the manipulation becomes, it cannot permanently defeat consistency. Actions always reveal what words attempt to hide. Character always surfaces beneath performance. Time becomes the greatest enemy of deception because maintaining an illusion forever demands impossible amounts of energy. There is also a psychological shift that occurs inside you when you fully embrace truth. Fear begins shrinking. Why? Because fear often comes from protecting an image. When you stop pretending to be perfect, criticism loses much of its power. When you stop seeking universal approval, rejection becomes less threatening. When you stop hiding who you are, there is very little left for anyone to expose. That kind of freedom is difficult for manipulators to understand. They expect everyone to value appearances as much as they do. They assume everyone has secrets that can be used against them. They assume everyone can be pressured into silence. Then they encounter someone whose greatest strength is authenticity, and suddenly every psychological weapon they've relied on becomes ineffective. Eventually, they recognize something they never anticipated. Their influence wasn't destroyed by force, revenge, or intimidation. It dissolved because one person chose clarity over confusion, honesty over performance, and truth over fear. In that moment, every carefully crafted illusion began collapsing under the unbearable weight of reality, leaving them with nothing except the echoes of a strategy that could only survive in the presence of deception. The most unsettling sound in any battle is not shouting. It is the silence that follows a collapsing illusion. There comes a moment when every person who believed they held absolute control begins to feel something unfamiliar crawling into their thoughts. Doubt. It starts quietly, almost unnoticed. The confidence they once carried so effortlessly begins to crack beneath the weight of reality. Their strategy hasn't changed. Their methods remain the same. But the person standing in front of them is no longer responding the way they expected. That is where their confidence begins to die. People who rely on control often mistake predictability for power. They believe that if they can anticipate your emotions, they can direct your decisions. If they know what makes you angry, they know how to distract you. If they know what makes you insecure, they know how to weaken you. Their confidence is built entirely upon one dangerous assumption. that you will always react exactly as you did before. But growth destroys predictability. The moment you stop reacting from old wounds and start responding from wisdom, every calculation they made becomes worthless. Imagine someone spending years learning how to unlock a door only to discover that the entire building has been replaced. Every key in their possession suddenly becomes useless. Their preparation, once their greatest advantage, transforms into evidence of how badly they misunderstood you. This is why people become visibly uncomfortable when they lose psychological control. They may pretend nothing has changed, but their behavior begins revealing the truth. They repeat themselves more often. They become louder without becoming more convincing. They interrupt because listening feels dangerous. They accuse because explaining no longer works. Every action is an attempt to recover the certainty they once enjoyed. The interesting part is that they rarely realize what actually happened. They assume someone influenced you. They believe someone coached you. They invent stories about hidden motives because accepting the real explanation would force them to confront something painful. You simply evolved beyond their influence. That realization is difficult for an insecure mind to accept. It is much easier to believe outside forces changed you than to admit your own methods stopped working. Confidence built on control has an expiration date. Authentic confidence grows stronger when challenged because it is rooted in character. False confidence weakens under pressure because it depends on circumstances remaining favorable. As long as everyone follows the expected script, manipulators appear composed. But the moment someone steps outside that script, uncertainty enters the room. Suddenly, they are forced to think instead of repeat. They are forced to adapt instead of dominate. Many people overlook how quickly arrogance turns into panic. At first, they dismiss your changes. They tell themselves you're pretending. Then they attempt the same old tactics, expecting familiar results. When those tactics fail, frustration replaces certainty. The confidence that once made them appear untouchable slowly begins unraveling. Small failures accumulate. Every conversation ends differently than expected. Every attempt to provoke you falls flat. Every prediction proves inaccurate. Psychologically, this creates what experts often describe as cognitive dissonance. The image they built of themselves no longer matches reality. They believed they understood people better than anyone else. They believed they could always stay one step ahead. Now reality is proving otherwise, and the human mind naturally resists accepting information that threatens its identity. Instead of admitting they were wrong, many double down. They become more controlling, more critical, and more desperate. Ironically, these desperate attempts reveal exactly how much power they have already lost. Truly confident people do not chase control. They don't need to. Only those afraid of losing influence become obsessed with forcing outcomes. Meanwhile, your calmness becomes their greatest source of discomfort. Every time you refuse unnecessary conflict, you remind them they no longer control your emotions. Every time you continue progressing without seeking revenge, you prove your future matters more than their opinion. Every time you choose discipline over drama, you widen the distance between your mindset and theirs. There's something incredibly powerful about refusing to participate in someone else's chaos. Chaos feeds on reaction. It survives through emotional energy. The moment that energy disappears, the entire structure begins collapsing under its own weight. Without realizing it, you force them into a battle against themselves. Their impatience becomes visible. Their insecurity becomes obvious. Their fear begins speaking louder than their confidence ever did. Eventually, even those watching from the outside begin noticing the shift. They see who remains composed under pressure and who falls apart when control slips away. Respect quietly changes direction. The people who once admired loud authority begin recognizing quiet strength instead. Influence follows authenticity, not intimidation. And in the end, the greatest victory is never watching someone else lose control. It is recognizing that while they spent years trying to master your reactions, you spent that same time mastering your own mind. And the moment they realized their confidence depended entirely on controlling someone who could no longer be controlled, The foundation beneath everything they believed collapsed without a single dramatic fight. The darkest prisons are not built with walls. They are built with silence, fear, and the belief that your voice doesn't matter. Somewhere along the way, someone convinced you that speaking your truth would cost you everything. They taught you to question your instincts, soften your opinions, and shrink your presence so others could remain comfortable. They wanted a version of you that apologized before every sentence, hesitated before every decision, and sought permission before every step. Because a silent mind is easier to control than an awakened one. There comes a moment when every person faces a choice. Continue living according to the expectations of people who never believed in your potential, or become the voice that no amount of pressure can silence. That choice is uncomfortable because finding your voice requires losing something first. You lose the need to please everyone. You lose the habit of explaining yourself to those determined to misunderstand you. You lose the fear of standing alone. At first, that feels like loneliness. Later, you realize it was freedom all along. Most people think confidence begins when everyone supports you. Reality works differently. Confidence is born in the moments when no one claps, no one agrees, and no one understands your vision, yet you continue moving forward anyway. It grows each time you choose principle over popularity. It strengthens every time you remain truthful, even when lying would have been easier. The strongest voices are not created in comfortable environments. They are forged in rejection, criticism, disappointment, and countless moments where giving up seemed like the logical option. People often confuse having a loud voice with having a powerful one. They are not the same. A loud voice seeks attention. A powerful voice commands respect because it is backed by character. It doesn't need to dominate conversations or interrupt others to prove its importance. It speaks with purpose. Every word carries weight because it comes from experience instead of ego. That is why emotionally mature people rarely waste energy arguing over everything. They understand that not every battle deserves participation. Some arguments are traps designed to drain your focus. Some criticisms are projections of another person's insecurity. Some opinions are simply distractions from your purpose. Learning when not to speak is just as important as knowing when to speak. Wisdom is measured not only by the words you choose, but also by the silence you protect. Your voice becomes unstoppable the moment it stops chasing validation. Think about how much energy people waste trying to convince everyone that they are worthy. They explain every decision, defend every dream, and argue against every misunderstanding. In doing so, they unknowingly surrender control of their peace. The more your confidence depends on other people's approval, the easier it becomes for those people to influence your emotions. Freedom begins when your self-worth no longer depends on outside opinions. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or dismissive. It means developing an internal foundation so strong that criticism becomes information rather than identity. You listen without absorbing unnecessary negativity. You accept constructive advice without allowing destructive judgment to define you. You recognize that disagreement is not rejection, and rejection is not failure. Every successful person eventually discovers that not everyone is meant to understand their path. There will always be individuals who attempt to silence confident voices, sometimes through ridicule, sometimes through manipulation, sometimes by questioning your abilities or reminding you of your past mistakes. But remember this, people usually attack what they secretly cannot control. Your confidence becomes threatening when it no longer responds to fear. Your discipline becomes intimidating when it remains consistent regardless of obstacles. Your authenticity becomes unforgettable because it cannot be copied. Imagine walking into every room knowing you have nothing to prove and nothing to hide. That kind of presence changes every interaction. You stop competing for attention because your purpose matters more than popularity. You stop speaking merely to fill silence because your words now carry intention. People begin listening differently, not because your voice became louder, but because your conviction became impossible to ignore. The greatest transformation is invisible. It happens inside the mind long before anyone notices it on the outside. Every time you choose courage over comfort, every time you remain honest under pressure, every time you protect your peace instead of feeding unnecessary conflict, you strengthen a voice that no criticism can erase. That voice becomes your identity. It becomes your reputation. It becomes the reason people remember you long after conversations end. And eventually, those who once believed they could intimidate, manipulate, or silence you are forced to witness something they never anticipated. Not a person seeking permission to be heard, but someone whose quiet confidence, unwavering purpose, and fearless truth have become so deeply rooted that no strategy, no deception, and no amount of opposition can ever make that voice disappear again.